Welcome to the Libertarian Institute YouTube and Odyssey channel. Today, Sheldon Richman and I will be going over three stories we came across in the last week, or in my case, things I have found in books. Sheldon, what is Tooth Fairy Economics from AIER?
Well, this is a great article by Phil Magnus, who's done great work going on many subjects, and David Henderson, a very good economist, writing about the proposal for reparations to African Americans, descendants of American slaves. I'm not sure who it's aimed at exactly, by the 1619 Project, which is running a TV series on, I think it is Hulu. Originally started a couple of years ago in 2019 as a New York Times magazine special, and has so distorted the history of what has happened in this country and making slavery the cause of everything bad that you can possibly think of, no matter what, including Microsoft Excel, the spreadsheet program. I mean, it's really crazy. Anyway, they point out that the proposal, as a matter of economics, they say, quote, reparations advocates offer surprisingly little in the way of viable options. If the U.S. government tried to implement the reparations program that the 1619 Project espouses, we would get huge increases in both taxes and inflation. The key economist advising on this proposal denies that any taxes would have to increase. According to the authors here, Magnus and Henderson, quote, a price tag of 13 trillion would be involved in this proposal. Quote, let's put this in perspective in two ways. First, 13 trillion is over half of current U.S. GDP. Second, it amounts to a $312,000 per black man, woman, and child. So it's not even just a descendant of slaves. It could be anybody who has darker skin. But skin color is a spectrum. There's not black and white. They say this verges on tooth fairy economics, that it would require no new taxes. As they put it, the cold reality of public finance means that every government outlay must eventually be paid for, whether through taxes in the present, higher inflation, which is also a tax, or higher taxes on future generations. The federal government has no good option when it comes to just, quote, just spending the money. If the spending occurred all in 1 year, inflation would be about 240%. And I asked the question, what good would that be to the recipients of those checks if prices were roughly going up at 240%?
My first one here is from the Libertarian Institute blog. Chris Rock has a new special, some of which is just brilliant and hilarious. However, it really throws a wrench in the thesis that it's not that no one wants to be educated, just some people don't have the opportunity. Well, if anyone has the opportunity, it's rich American celebrities, and they say some of the most outrageous things. First thing that stood out to me is Chris Rock said, it's the royal family. They invented colonialism. That is an actual quote from his Selective Outrage stand-up special. Here's a brief list of empires who engaged in colonialism before the royal family did. The Mongol Empire, Latin Empire, Hunnic Empire, Gallic Empire, Jin Dynasty, Han Dynasty, Roman Empire, Egyptian Empire, Persian Empire, Babylonian Empire, Islamic Empires, Marshi Empire. The list is just so extensive. Now, he talks about January 6th, and says it in a very confused voice. He says, you see the Capitol riots? White men trying to overthrow the government that they run. It does not occur to the social justice race essentialist mind that people who are the same race and gender have differing ideas on what is just or unjust. Just because two people are the same race or gender, it in no way means that the person or group with power is acting on behalf of those who share their gender or race. It's akin to saying, how did a war occur in China between Mao's communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists? They were all Chinese. How was there a Russian civil war between Reds and Whites? They're all Russian. Chris Rock then steps into foreign policy and says, America is in horrible shape. We got it worse than Ukraine. Yeah, I said it. Ukraine is united and America is divided. I guess after Chris Rock researched the stark contrast between Ukrainian separatists in the Donbass supporting Viktor Yanukovych and those in 2014 supporting Petro Poroshenko, leading to an 8-year civil war killing 14,000 people, Rock came to the conclusion that, like white men, all Ukrainians are on the same page. I also was not aware that Vladimir Zelensky was on the same page with the people who he enslaved via military conscription, the political parties he banned, and the media he nationalized. Now, it actually ends on a good note where Chris Rock says these Jim Crow laws were so out of control that at one point it was illegal for my mom in South Carolina to go to a dentist because a black person could not go legally to a white dentist. They literally had to go to a vet if they couldn't find a black dentist. So, in solidarity with Chris Rock, I said it's pure evil for a third party to forcibly restrict two consenting parties from engaging in a mutually beneficial voluntary economic exchange. This is the central goal of the Libertarian Institute, and on this issue, we stand firmly with Chris Rock. Sheldon, what else do we have from the American Institute for Economic Research?
Well, by the way, I was kind of pro Chris Rock when he was hit by Will Smith, but I'm not pro Chris Rock anymore. I think he did a terrible job in even talking about that incident. Okay, the next article is again by Michael Munger. I've been citing a lot of Michael Munger in recent weeks, called "This is Why We Can't Have Nice Things: Directionalists versus Destinationists." So he says, he first of all quotes an article of his from a few years ago, 2018. Quote, "I'm a directional libertarian. That means that if a proposed new policy of reform or reform of an existing policy cuts spending or increases liberty, I'm for it, even if it isn't a real libertarian policy," close quote. So he in other words, incrementalist versus somebody who won't be satisfied until they get everything right now today. He calls the incrementalist directional libertarian or directionalism, and those who stand by and say, no, I want all or nothing, those are destinationalisms. This is a very good article. You can make up your own mind. I have some quibbles with it, but I won't go into those. Read the article for yourself. There's some nice little history of the libertarian movement stated in there. For example, when very in the early days of the Foundation for Economic Education, who I used to work for 15 years, I edited their magazine, The Freeman, a paper magazine, which I don't think exists anymore. They published Leonard Read published a column or a pamphlet by a young Milton Friedman and a young George Stigler on against rent control, called Ceilings or Roofs, and pointing out that there's much less housing when there's rent control because you're holding prices below market level, and therefore you drive producers out of that market. They go somewhere else, and they don't produce as many apartments. That also had a line, though. It didn't talk about property rights. It only talked about humanitarian concerns, how people cannot find places to live in New York City. It was about New York. Fee was actually a victim of rent control when it was finding a headquarters. That's why it ended up in the suburbs of Irvington on Hudson. But the article didn't talk about property rights, so it was objected to once it came out by Ayn Rand and Rose Wilder Lane, names you might know as pioneers of the modern libertarian movement, criticizing Friedman and Stigler as communists, as Reds, for making these kinds of arguments rather than what about the right of landlords to bargain freely with tenants. And that's a good point. I'm not sure it really goes to the Munger's point about directionalism and destinationism, but it's still very interesting. And his argument before he gets to that is still very interesting. I definitely commend the article. I think it's well written. Of course, anything he writes is well written, and there's thought-provoking material in this article. However, I think he misses the point when it comes to Rand and Wilder Lane's criticism of the Friedman and Stigler point. It's one thing to make a point that more housing would be available. That's certainly a fine point to make. But how do you not invoke property rights when arguing against rent control and other wage and price controls, as well as a whole bunch of things that the government does?
I once asked Jeffrey Tucker if there was one book you could recommend for people to read, assume that they're not libertarians, what would you recommend? And he gave me this book by Auburn Herbert, published in, looks like 1885, titled The Right and Wrong of Compulsion by the State. There's one really interesting, well, there's many interesting quotes in this one, but one specifically stood out to me just because I spent the weekend around quite a few leftists who were advocating things like equality. Herbert says, "And now let us look a little more closely into the rights of the individual. I claim that he is by right the master of himself and his own faculties and energies. If he is not, who is? Let us suppose that A, having no rights over himself, B and C, being in a majority, have no rights over him. But we must assume an equality in these matters. And if A has no rights over himself, neither can B and C have any rights over themselves. To what a ridiculous position we are then brought. B and C, having no rights over themselves, have absolute rights over A, and we should have to suppose, in this most topsy-turvy of worlds, that men, we are talking about, not owning themselves, as any simple-minded person would naturally conclude they did, but owning some other of their fellow men, and presently, in their turn perhaps, to be themselves owned by some other." So what he's getting at here is that if we say that you actually don't have the right to make a voluntary exchange without some third party coercively entering, there is no principal difference between doing something under the guise of it being the public sector versus the private sector. But what non-libertarians so often advocate is you don't have the right to make decisions in the voluntary sector, but once you enter the political realm, then you can not only vote for things that you'll reap benefits from, you can now coerce others into doing things you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. So I think Auburn Herbert comes in with such a great amount of wisdom, especially for the late 1800s. He also wrote an essay in the early 1900s titled "A Plea for Voluntarism." He was the main person motivating me to write the Voluntarist Handbook, to bring his works to light to many people who were not familiar with it. Next one, On the Brink, Jennings' Rising Resistance. What is this about?
Well, this is a very good video that I commend to everyone, put out by Mondo Weiss, and it is, I guess, written and the main speaker besides the Palestinian people that are interviewed is Yumna Patel, and it points out that there was a terrible January 26th of this year raid by the Israeli Defense Force into Jenin, which is a very important refugee camp in the West Bank, and it's been hit repeatedly. But 10 people were killed, 9 on the spot, 1 died afterwards, and it's been very terrible. As they say in the video, which I highly recommend, Palestinian health officials say at least 9 Palestinians have been killed. Actually, 1 died of injuries afterwards. It was the bloodiest few hours. Actually, it was about 5 hours. The West Bank had seen in years. More than 100 military vehicles entered the camp. This was January 26th. 10 Palestinians. This also included 2 teenage boys and a 61-year-old woman just sitting in her home were killed in a single Israeli army raid. Dozens more were injured. Palestinians described it as a massacre, and it all took place in an area of less than half a square kilometer. Now, you may say, well, what is Jenin? Jenin is a refugee camp, quote, home to over 15,000 Palestinians, the descendants of those who were forced out of their homes by Zionist militias in 1948. This was at the foundation during the creation of the State of Israel. Jenin is also home, quote, to armed resistance groups. These are young people who are putting aside their factional differences, because there have been factions within the Palestinians, putting aside their factional differences and saying, look, we're not going to take this anymore. It's been 56 years since the territories we call occupied territories were taken militarily by Israel, and about 73 to 5 years that Israel has existed, which was founded on land occupied by individual Palestinian landowners, many of whom were driven out of their homes, and the ones who managed to stay on were turned into third, at best, second-class citizens. It's a terrible situation that goes on and on. The Netanyahu government is only the latest problem. He's not the only problem, as many people think. There are many other politicians that are problems. It's inherent in the Israeli project to drive out the Palestinians. They would like them all to leave. They don't want to hold them captive. They want them to leave. But enough people will not leave because they have been there for many, many generations, 1,000 years. And they're not going to leave because the UN one time in 1947 recommended partition of land that had no right to partition.
My final one this week is a section from a book titled Chaos Theory by Bob Murphy, where he takes on two of the biggest criticisms that libertarians get. They say, well, in the absence of a state, you wouldn't have things like a military to defend you, and you wouldn't have a good legal system. Government currently provides those, therefore a state is necessary. Here's two sections from this book that I think are very intriguing. He addresses, won't the mafia take over? He says, it is paradoxical that the fear of rule by organized crime families causes people to support the state, which is the most organized and criminal association in human history. Even if it were true that under market anarchy, people had to pay protection money and occasionally get whacked, this would be a drop in the bucket compared to the taxation and wartime deaths caused by governments. But even this concedes too much, for the mob derives its strength from government, not the free market. All of the businesses traditionally associated with organized crime, gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, drug dealing, are prohibited or heavily regulated by the state. In market anarchy, true professionals would drive out such unscrupulous competitors. In response to, your insurance companies would become the state. Murphy responds, on the contrary, the private companies providing legal services would have far less power under market anarchy than governments currently possess. Most obvious, there would be no power to tax or monopolize a service. One of the great lessons you can take away is from a section he titled Apples and Oranges. He says, this theoretical discussion is sure to provoke the cynic to remark, I'd like to see what your insurance companies would do if they met a Panzer division. But such questions miss the point. We have demonstrated that a private defense system is the most effective, not that it is invulnerable. Yes, a small society of anarchists would be unable to repel the total might of National Socialist Germany. But a small society of statists would fare even worse. And in fact, plenty of government militaries were obliterated by Hitler's armies and Stalin's armies and Afghani armies and Chinese armies, and ever since the beginning of time. Chaos Theory by Robert P. Murphy is an excellent introduction into the concepts of voluntarism and anarchism. Thanks to everyone for watching the Libertarian Institute, Odyssey, and YouTube podcast. Sheldon, thanks so much for your time.
Anytime.